All right, you know what we've been talking about since last week. We're talking about pimps. We're talking about preachers. We're talking about prosperity gospel. We're talking about white supremacy. We're talking about subscription giving. We're talking about on the internet. We're talking about paywalls. We're talking about everything. Don't go nowhere. Stay right with me. I forgot which one I was on, but I'm going to get to it in a second.
You can do it. Don't stop. Ed Montgomery. Come on. A new way of thinking. Transform your mind. Straight from the vine. Fresh new wine.
All right. Let's really look at this thing because we were talking about subscription giving. We were talking about how people pay cable charges, subscription giving. If you go on radio, you can pay a subscription and listen to the radio. Not only that, but you can even pay up a higher price and listen to more stations. You can go on cable. They're now breaking that up, and you can pay-per-view. You can go get the Paramount, CBS, all these different stations and networks. You can pay Disney. You can pay separate or a combination of several of those, and you can get that group and pay a particular price range if that's what you want. In other words, you can pay for what you want if that's what you want. Now, if you look at it, the same thing is happening in religion. People are paying for what they want. There are people who are saying, well, that religion ought to not be like that. Why do people have to give in religion anyway? Why do people have to give? Well, it's the same way you're dealing with education. There is some things as religious education. There are people who want to move deeper in religious education than where they are, than what they're getting in their particular churches, and they want to pay to go to other levels. That's called school. That's called divinity school. That's called, I was getting ready to say cemetery, but it's seminary. All of these things are different. There are different teachings, different ways. You can get on the radio, and even though you got a subscription, you can also ask people, and I hear some black stations along with some black programs. I don't get into it, but they'll talk about, listen, why don't you give to our particular program because we're helping people. As a matter of fact, instead of sending your tithe to your church, why don't you send your tithe to this? And they'll say, well, because if your church is not doing this, then you shouldn't be giving your tithe over here. And I'm sitting there listening a lot of times. I'm saying, do people even understand what they talk about with the tithe, what the tithe is all about? And when you talk about the tithe, let me say this about it. The tithe, T-I, it means tenth. So if you got $10, a tithe is $1. If you got a tithe is a dime. If you got $100, a tithe is $10. Some people may say, well, that's nothing, Dr. Ed. Yeah, $10 out of 100. If I got $100, if I got $10, $1 out of 10, that's absolutely nothing. But there are people whose budget they may bring in. Well, let's move it from $10, at least 100. I just want to make numbers simple and easy so that we can catch it mentally very fast. So if their income is $100 and they owe $120, then when they pay or they give a tithe or pay a tithe, I know some people will, it's the difference between giving a tithe and paying a tithe. Or when they pay a tithe, then that's the $10 out of 100, which only leaves them with 90. And so now they got to pay $120, which is their bill that they got in order to survive. And so that's 90, 100, 110, and 20. That's $30 that they're missing out of their budget. So they need to hurry and get to keep their tithe because their rent might be $120 and they pay their tithe, or they rent might be $100. They won't be able to pay their tithe. Listen, I totally understand that, and we tell people all the time, if you can't pay your rent, don't make sense. The problem And people say, well, if you don't pay your tithe, then God won't bless you. Well, that's not particularly true. That's not the way it works. If your income is $100 and your bills are $120, and somebody's begging you for a tithe, which is $10, then the tithe is not the problem. You need to get away from that. At least don't even worry about the tithe. The problem is that you paying $120 out of 100. Well, you can't pay $120 out of 100. That's why they make credit cards. In other words, people are going into debt. In other words, you're overextended. Where you have to work on is not the tithe, you work on the overextension. Now comes education. Education of how to be able to get out of that $120 deal and get it into under $100. You said, oh, in other words, a budget. No, I don't call it a budget. I call it a spending plan. Now, this is education. You begin to change your mindset of how you think. I wrote a book probably in the late 80s called Breaking the Spirit of Poverty. And I wrote it in response to white prosperity preachers. Because what they were preaching concerning prosperity did not connect with how black people need to deal with prosperity. So, and I made it clear that I don't agree with that. So I've been doing this since I've been teaching for over 50 years. So I dealt with that a long time ago. Well, the whole thing about the tithe is, forget about the tithe, you got to get into a spending plan. Once you understand the spending plan, now you might be able to look at, okay, got $100 coming in and I got $80 going out, or $90 going out, or $100 going out. And you may say, well, what is the tithe? It becomes a type of spiritual thing. See, there are people who believe that the spirit is more empowering than the natural, that what's in the natural begins in the spiritual. There's some people who don't, but there's some people who do. And some people who are motivated by that spiritual thing. And how they believe it is how they believe. Now, what is the tithe? How does it work? You read it in the scriptures, and I promise you, what you're reading, what you're seeing and reading, your mind is not grasping because you're hearing it through the filters of what's coming through your pulpits or your teachers. Don't you go anywhere. Stay with me right now, because what I'm about to open up to you can begin to change everything, at least in this particular area. Watch this. I'll be right back. I know I'm not supposed to be interrupting right here, but remember, myalc.org. That's myalc.org. And you can also give at 713-742-2035. You can use your text to give or use your app. If you're on the app, you can go right to that donate button and it won't change anything. You say, why in the world would you break my concentration? I'm sorry, but I wanted you to remember, because you know what? Just like there's a break in here, there's also going to be a breakthrough in your life. I believe that. Now, let's go back. All right, make sure you hit that comment button. Make sure, let me know if you're catching this. Say, okay, I hear you. Don't just sit there and get the teaching and don't let me know. Okay, I hear what you're talking about. If you're saying, don't know, you can put a question mark there. Also hit that like button right where you are. Let me know that you are there. That scripture tithe, you know that tithe in scripture that comes out of Malachi 3 and 10. You know when the pastor brings out Malachi 3 and 10. Now, who am I talking about? You talking about talking to everybody in the world? I'm talking to the people who've been hearing about the thing about the tithing. If you ain't into this, hey, you might click me off right now, but those that understand what I'm talking about, let's talk. This is going to change everything. And that Malachi 3:10 says, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. In other words, it says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me in tithes and offerings. Now, that's where they get people. In other words, will a man rob God? You're robbing God when you don't pay your tithes. This is what they tell you. You're robbing God when you don't pay your tithes. Well, if you don't have the tithe and you're not paying the tithe, how in the world can you rob God? How can you rob God of anything that already is God's? How can you rob God if what belongs to God, now here comes the catch, if what belongs to God also belongs to you? If what belongs to God belongs to you because God is within you, God is in you and you are in God, then you can't rob God. The only person you can be robbing is yourself. So the tithe may be the beginning of what you consider to be a spending plan. But let's set that over here and go on down through the scripture. Will a man rob God? And he says, yet you have robbed me. I'm talking King James Version 2. Yet you have robbed me in tithes and offerings. And he says, bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that I may have meat in my house. Now listen, he didn't say bring the tithe to God. See, we hear people say, you need to bring your tithe to the Lord. In other words, which means bring it to the church. He says, bring it into the storehouse, that there might be meat. The word meat means resources in my house. Bring ye the tithe into the storehouse. In other words, that there might be resources. In other words, so the tithe goes into a space that creates resources for your community. Oh my goodness. I just moved my desk. See how much power is in here? Bring ye the tithe into the storehouse, that there might be resources. He then goes on to says, and he says, prove me, test me, try me. He says, try it one time and see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that you won't have room enough to receive. Now, you must understand that blessings at that particular time, God was talking to an agricultural Judaism, a Jewish group of people. This is not the same economy. This is not capitalism. This is agricultural finance. In other words, they got 10 barrels of corn. Then if they got 12 barrels of corn, they were prosperous. If they got 15 barrels of wheat, they were prosperous if all they needed was 10 barrels to live. So what they would do, out of the 10 barrels, if they got 15, they would take the tithe, which is 1.5, and they would bring it into the storehouse for the rest of the community. Following what I'm saying? And this is how there might be resources. So what in the world did these people pray for? Here in America, we praying for money from the sky. We praying that God will put a check in the mailbox. We praying that somebody will help me to do this. God will give me this, and that God will pay my rent, or God will give me a brand new car. People ask me all the time, so yeah, you praying for God to give you a brand new car. I said, a brand new car is not a hard thing to get. The hard thing you got to get is to be able to pay the note. You can get a brand new car. But it says, but why do they pray? What's the windows of heaven? First of all, there was an agriculture community. The agriculture community depended upon two things: rain and to get rid of the bugs that ate up the crops. Pestilence, bugs, grasshoppers that destroy the crops. No rain, no crops. Pestilence. We got a problem in America now because you're dealing with a government that cannot sell the extra barrels. So you got 10 barrels of wheat. And the farmers are saying, hey, we had a good rain and got rid of the pestilence. We got 15 barrels of wheat that we need to sell to China. And so all of a sudden, a deal comes out of Washington that says it's Venezuela that's going to be, we're sending money to Venezuela, and that's who's going. And so Venezuela says, we're making a deal with China, and so China is getting the wheat from Venezuela. Well, actually, it's the beef, but Venezuela. And so America can't even sell the 10 barrels, let alone the 15 barrels that you consider to be the prosperity or the overage. So what's happened to this wheat? This wheat is sitting up and it is rotten because they can't sell it when you can't sell it. So now you've added something else. It's not just a lack of rain. If God doesn't send rain, then the crops won't grow. If God lets the grasshoppers come in, then the crops will be destroyed. But now, if you put the wrong people in government, then you cannot sell the crops. So it doesn't matter whether you tithe or not. The tithing is what keeps the community alive when you have corruption in the government, or when there is pestilence, or when there is no rain. Well, what's that got to do with the way we live now? Rain is how things prosper. Rain is what comes down from the sky that you and it hits the earth, and the earth brings forth things. That's crops, that's agriculture. But you say, well, what about me? I work in a bar. I'm a bartender. Well, excuse me. If I'm a bartender, then where's my rain? Well, your rain is however many people are coming into that bar and how many people are buying drinks. So that's why they try to get you in to get folk in there to get 2 for $1 or 2 for $10 or whatever, because your overage is based on that. What is pestilence? That's when COVID comes in, and they can't go in because people got to wear the mask and things of that sort. So guess what? They're shutting things down because people can get sick and people can die. But what's the government aspect of it? The government aspect comes in to where they turn around, and even though the government says we are, you're not going to have to pay taxes on your tips. Well, if the bar owners take the tips and divide the tips among 6 people to make it fair, what are tips for anyway? Tips is believed to be by the people who patronize the business to be for the person who gives them good service. Well, the person that gives them good service means not only the person that comes and takes their order and is very nice and jovial and chats them up and, hey, how are you? And what do you need? Some water. Who brings the water? The guys ladies, whoever who are the water people who bring the water people. It's not necessarily the waiter or the waitress that brings the water. What happens when the food comes? Somebody else comes along with these plates that they're holding. Not necessarily the waitress. Sometimes the waitress, sometimes not. It's based on what kind of business it is. When you get ready to leave and you need to clear, let me get this off of your table, so you can clear the table and clear the crumbs off of your beautiful fine linen where you have dined. It's not always the waiter or the waitress. It could be somebody else. So that waiter or waitress has a team, and it might be 3 people on that team, and they got to pay. That's the way the business comes in. But if that business turns around and says, well, we're going to put that table ain't getting no money. We're going to add that team over there to your team, so you got to be split it 6 ways instead of 3 ways. So what's the use of me being nice? I can just go ahead and be mean. What difference do it make? I'm not making no money extra anyway. That's why they all like cash. So what do? As a church person, here's what I do. I give them cash as a tip. I slip them cash as a tip. Well, why do you give them cash as a tip? And I give them maybe a little bit more or more than they normally get. Than they're charging, putting it on 18%, 20% and everything. I'm going to give them more than that. Why do you do that, Dr. Ed? And I may go to the same restaurant over and over again for about 2 or 3 months, and I go overboard with the tips to those particular people. Why? because of the resources that have come into the house. Benevolence offerings that come into the church. I can get so and so X amount of dollars that I can use to help those who are poor. You said, but those people are working, they're not poor. Oh, yes, they are. They are called the working poor. The working poor can never move up to the middle class because they keep the working poor down. Actually, the thrust is to keep them downward and to push them down. So God promises, here's what I will do. I will send rain. I'll send customers. Not only that, I will push all those who are trying to take your money away from you. I will rebuke the devourer for your sake. Scripture, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to need some folk to help you to interpret. If you're going to believe this stuff, either you're going to believe it or let it go, or just get out of religion altogether. But spirit, there's a difference between Christianity and Christianity Incorporated. There's a difference between who that Jesus person was, who taught us how to love our neighbors, and the people who manipulated and took the scripture and preached it different to teach that black people were cursed, or to teach that black people were slaves, or to teach that and got it all into the government of America and all into the 1800s and the Civil War and Reconstruction, and taught it and taught it and taught it to where they didn't just take cash or use black skin as currency or on an auction block, but they used it to teach that black people were not valuable. My time is up. I got to stop here. Hello, my friends. I'm Ed Montgomery. You know me, Pastor Ed, Dr. Ed. Thank you so much for doing what you do and contributing from your heart. People think giving comes from the pocket. Never has. It comes directly from the heart. In the world that we're living in right now, so many changes, so many things happening that will make us lose our faith. Listen, I've got to teach more than I've ever taught. Stay online more than I've ever been online. Because it's not just going to be enough to encourage. We're reteaching the faith. That's right, reteaching the faith. Because we have to begin to strengthen the teaching so that people who've never heard this gospel like this before can hear it and continue to move on. So when you give, you're pushing me and telling me and challenging me to keep going forward. Take a moment, go to myalc.org. That's myalc.org. Myalc.org. And go ahead and click that donate button. It is safe, it is secure, and not only that, but it only takes just a couple of minutes, maybe even a few seconds for those of you that are already signed up. Or if you want to use your phone, wherever you're watching or however you're watching, you can use text to give. And that's 713-742-2035. 713-742-2035. Or you can go old school and you can write a check and send it in to Abundant Life Center or Ed Montgomery. It doesn't go into my pocket, it goes into our ministry. 772-300, Houston, Texas, 77215. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for what you already do. I am praying for you, and I'm praying the best over your gift and over the offering. And I pray that abundance will continue to flow in your life in so many different ways. It'll warm your heart. God bless you. Hey, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Hit that subscribe button, smash it, crash